Deco TV presents the 1960s. November 8th, 1960, John F. Kennedy is elected the 35th President of the United States, narrowly beating then Vice President Richard Nixon. Kennedy promises social and economic reforms while confronting the challenges of the Cold War. April 12, 1961, astronaut Yuri Gagarin becomes the first human to orbit the Earth, significantly heating up the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. 5 days later, on April 17, 1961, in a daring invasion, Cuban exiles, supported by the United States, launch an attack on the Bay of Pigs. The attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro's regime ultimately fails, resulting in a significant blow to U.S. foreign policy. Meanwhile, at home, tensions continued to rise in the fight for civil rights as freedom riders challenged segregation laws in the South, facing violence and arrests along the way. July 1962, in a remarkable technological advancement, live television broadcasts were transmitted across the Atlantic Ocean for the first time, bringing the world closer together. August 5, 1962, in South Africa, anti-apartheid activist Nelson Mandela is imprisoned, sparking international outrage and calls for his immediate release. Mandela won't be released until 1990. October 1962, the world holds its breath as the Cuban Missile Crisis escalates, with President Kennedy demanding the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba to avert a nuclear catastrophe. A victory for gender equality in June of 1963 as President Kennedy signs the Equal Pay Act into law, aiming to close the wage gap between men and women. Just over 2 months later, thousands gather in Washington, D.C. for the historic Civil Rights March, demanding an end to racial segregation and discrimination. Tragedy strikes the nation on November 22, 1963, as President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, sending shockwaves around the globe. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson is sworn in as the 36th President of the United States aboard Air Force One. July 2, 1964. In a landmark moment for civil rights, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law, prohibiting discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. January 11, 1964. Surgeon General Luther Terry releases his 150,000-word report, Smoking and Health, which identifies cigarette smoking as the leading cause of lung cancer and additional health concerns. 42% of American adults smoke at the time of the report's release. Civil rights leader Malcolm X is assassinated in New York City on February 21, 1965, another of the tragic assassinations that plagued the decade. The war in Vietnam intensifies throughout 1966 as the United States increased its military involvement, drawing criticism and protests at home and abroad. More than 6,000 Americans have been killed and 30,000 wounded by the close of the year. October 2, 1967, in a historic appointment, Thurgood Marshall becomes the first African-American Supreme Court Justice, championing civil rights and equality under the law. December 3, 1967, a medical breakthrough occurs as doctors successfully performed the world's first heart transplant at Groote Schuur Hospital in Cape Town, South Africa, offering hope to patients with life-threatening heart conditions. April 4, 1968, civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is tragically assassinated as he stands on the second-floor balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. In the last of the 4 major assassinations to take place in the decade, Robert Kennedy is shot shortly after midnight at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles by Sirhan Sirhan, June 6, 1968. November 5, 1968, the culmination of one of the great political comebacks. Richard Nixon wins the presidency, promising to bring law and order to a nation grappling with social unrest. June 28, 1969, in Greenwich Village, the LGBTQ+ community fights back against police harassment at the Stonewall Inn, igniting the modern gay rights movement. July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong becomes the first person to walk on the moon as commander of the Apollo 11 mission, fulfilling President Kennedy's vision of reaching the lunar surface before the end of the decade. August 15th, 1969. In a celebration of peace and music, hundreds of thousands gather at the Woodstock Music and Art Fair, defining a generation and its countercultural movement. It remains one of the largest music festivals in history. As the 1960s drew to a close, while there was a sense of pride and accomplishment in the many technological advancements, there was also profound disillusionment and unrest, fueled by the Vietnam War, social upheaval, and political turbulence that Americans could only hope would improve over the following decade.